Welcome to the Christian Post podcast. I'm Billy Hallowell, and we are going to be taking you behind the headlines of some of the most important and impactful stories of the week. I am joined today by Christian Post staff reporter Ryan Foley. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for coming on. And we've got two issues today that we're going to be diving into and giving people sort of perspective and understanding of what's happening again behind the headlines. And the first story involves the Catholic Church and communion. And I know there's this move among many U.S. bishops to consider opening the door to denying communion to pro-abortion politicians. So I guess we'll just start there. What is driving that?
Well, the bishops actually already approved a document on the meaning of the Eucharist in the life of the Church 2 weeks ago at their General Assembly meeting. And ahead of the vote, Archbishop of Kansas City and the chair of the USCCB's Committee on Pro-Life Activities said that because President Biden is Catholic, it presents a unique problem for us. And he said it can create confusion because how can he say he's a devout Catholic and he's doing these things that are contrary to church teaching? But after the vote, the USCCB went out of its way to clarify that the new policy, the document on the meaning of the Eucharist in the life of the Church, would not lead to the withholding of communion from pro-abortion Catholic politicians, stressing that the document being drafted is not meant to be disciplinary in nature, nor is it targeted at any one individual or class of persons. And it will include a section on the Church's teaching on the responsibility of every Catholic, including bishops, to live in accordance with the truth, goodness, and beauty of the Eucharist we celebrate. So the Catholic Church teaches that those obstinately preserving in manifest grave sin are not to be admitted to Holy Communion. And then in 2004, Cardinal Ratzinger, who the following year would become Pope Benedict XVI, told bishops in the U.S. that the Church teaches that abortion or euthanasia is a grave sin, and that in the case of an intrinsically unjust law, such as a law permitting abortion or euthanasia, it is therefore never licit to obey it or to take part in a propaganda campaign in favor of such a law or to vote for it. Therefore, by promoting loose abortion laws, these politicians are committing manifest grave sin and therefore should not be admitted to communion.
So can I ask you this? Because I find it interesting, and I know a lot of people listening may also be curious about this. This is not a new issue, right? You've had House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and others who are Catholic who have been taking communion and have not been denied. Why do you think the Catholic Church has up to now not addressed this as fervently as it seems like some want to do so now?
Well, a couple of weeks ago, I covered a Students for Life of America rally outside the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., and one of the speakers there, Terry Schilling of the American Principles Project, suggested that addressing the issue would make church leaders feel uncomfortable or put them in a difficult position. The bottom line is that the church does not want to appear too political because it fears that acting political would cause them to lose their tax-exempt status.
Well, and it seems like that fear may actually be a legitimate fear, because I know at least one Democrat responded to the claims of communion being rescinded for pro-abortion Catholics with a threat of rescinding the Catholic Church's 501c3 status. Can you explain that issue a little bit, why that matters, and what's been going on in regards to that?
Well, that would be Representative Jared Huffman, who was the only self-described humanist in the last Congress. And he suggests that if they're going to politically weaponize religion by rebuking Democrats who support women's reproductive choice, then a rebuke of their tax-exempt status may be in order. So 501c3 organizations include churches and religious organizations that do not have to pay federal income tax, but the Johnson Amendment, passed in 1954, mandates that in exchange for tax-exempt status, 501c3 organizations are not to engage in political advocacy specifically when it comes to endorsing or opposing specific candidates.
Yeah, and what's interesting about this is that you're talking about an issue here, right? You're talking about abortion, which is an issue that is incredibly important to many religious people, their position on it, especially in the Christian church. And the Johnson Amendment seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, specific to endorsing or rejecting a candidate, not necessarily an issue, which is what makes that 501c3 status threat sort of fascinating to me. I don't know if you want to speak to that at all.
I mean, as a Catholic myself, I know that priests often talk about issues like ahead of the election. They told us what issues were the most important ones to focus on.
Yeah. And it doesn't seem like that is in any sort of violation at all of the Johnson Amendment. So it seems like there's a lot going on there. And I think we'll probably see more of that debate unfold. There's also a broader debate about 501c3 status, honestly, in general, and churches. This is not a new issue by any stretch of the imagination. And before we transition to the next topic, just one more question on this, because there are a number of Catholics in Congress, and obviously the president of the United States. They are, they say they're practicing Catholics, but they are, pro-choice. They're pro-abortion, depending on the terminology you want to use. Why do these people feel, and have they spoken out about this, that they should still be able to take communion despite their views that are in contradiction to the Catholic Church?
Well, the group of these members of Congress who are Catholic and support abortion wrote a letter describing the sacrament of Holy Communion as central to the life of practicing Catholics. So, the bottom line is that pro-abortion Catholic Democrats who wrote that letter see receiving Holy Communion as a right of all Catholics, while the Church teaches that the reception of Holy Communion is a privilege for Catholics who do not have grave sins on their souls. So at that Students for Life rally I covered, Dr. Michael News said that it's not just people who advocate for abortion who should refrain from receiving communion. It's those engaged in premarital or extramarital sex, looking at pornography, or failing to attend weekly mass without good reason, as well as they should go out saying people who have committed murders or rapes. So it's not just specific to politicians who support abortion, but they get a lot of attention because they, unlike most people, I would say, are very public with their admission that they are advocating for something that is contradictory to church teaching.
Sure. And not just sharing their opinion on it, they're also advocating for laws that would enact that opinion at a legislative level. So, all right, well, we're going to transition to the next topic, and this is the transgender sports debate. And this seems to be kicking up into high gear. You have states enacting bills aimed at protecting women's sports. And of course, not everybody would describe those bills in that way. Can you explain the intent of these transgender sports bills, what they're trying to accomplish?
Well, these bills come as many states, including Connecticut, have implemented policies that allow K through 12 athletes to compete on sports teams that correspond with their gender identity as opposed to their biological sex. The other states are looking to protect women's sports by passing bills that require athletes to compete on the sports teams that match their biological gender. So far, these bills have passed in Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Idaho, Mississippi, Montana, Tennessee, and West Virginia. And the reason they're doing this is because of the innate biological differences between males and females that give men an advantage over women in sports. A couple of years ago, Laura Ingraham on her Fox News show pointed out the differences, which include the fact that male bones are bigger in both size and density. Females have shorter arms and legs relative to body size. Females are around 30 to 35% muscle by weight. Males are 40 to 50% muscle. Females' ligaments are thinner and softer than males, and the internal organs of males tend to be bigger, broader, more capable of taking in oxygen.
Yeah, and this is a really heated debate. And one of the things that's interesting about you is that as a reporter and a staff writer, you've been able to interact and talk with some female athletes and their families, and you've been able to research and see some of what these individuals are saying. What are you hearing from them? Because they're the ones on the front lines as athletes and, again, loved ones and family members of those athletes of this issue.
Well, female athletes are understandably upset about policies that allow biological males to compete against them. One of the girls I spoke to for the article, a collegiate athlete who runs track, said that the NCAA, which governs collegiate athletics at many institutions in the U.S., had a very outdated policy when it comes to transgender athletes. Specifically, she said that there wasn't a lot of regulation, there wasn't a lot of jurisdiction, there was a lot of leeway, and there's conflicting opinions on when the transgender athletes sort of see their innate biological advantages disappear. The NCAA Gender Inclusion Handbook declares that any strength and endurance advantages a transgender woman arguably may have as a result of her prior testosterone levels dissipate after about 1 year of hormone therapy, while a study from the British Journal of Sports Medicine found that even after 2 years of taking feminizing hormones, trans-identified males still ran 12% faster than their female counterparts. So the girl I spoke to, who was a runner at Georgetown, and she actually spoke at CPAC earlier in the year, she is speaking out on this because she doesn't want women to feel as if they've already been beat before they've started a race, or they've been beaten before entering the arena or playing basketball or whatever sport it may be. She warned that letting biological males compete against sports will mean that girls are no longer going to be interested in competing and being a part of sports. And then I also talked to a mother of one of the athletes suing Connecticut over its policy allowing biological males to run against females. She said that allowing men to compete against women creates a ripple effect because when men end up winning races, as they have in Connecticut, it prevents biological females from advancing to other championships, races, and or claiming certain titles. And it has prevented some of those girls who are suing Connecticut from missing out on certain opportunities that include the opportunity to meet with college scouts.
So one of the things that has been brought up on the other side, critics allege that these bills are hateful. And you've looked a lot at this issue. Obviously, there's a lot of emotion and complexity here. How would you respond to those claims that the contents of the bill and the intent of the bills are somehow hateful?
The content of these bills are logical, given the differences between men and women, which is what these bills seek to address. They're pretty focused on that one issue and not the transgender debate as a whole, which is definitely becoming more prominent with the Biden administration coming out against the efforts taken by the states.
So this is more of a loaded question, and it's the last question I'm going to ask you about this. But a lot of people are hearing the term Title IX be thrown around, and they may not know what it is or how it plays into this debate, especially considering the Biden administration's stance on Title IX. Can you explain that a little bit for us?
Well, Title IX was passed in 1972 in order to give women equal opportunities in education, including in sports. The idea of the bill was to prevent discrimination on the basis of sex in education, and Title IX originally recognized the inherent biological differences between men and women, and since its passage, a lot of advances have been made in women's sports. But the Biden administration has concluded that the Title IX's prohibition on the basis of discrimination on the basis of sex also applies to sexual orientation and gender identity. Conservative groups are warning of the implications of this interpretation, specifically that it will allow biologically males students access to female-only spaces and allow them to be housed with females during overnight school trips and events and participate in female-only sports, because the federal government now believes that such actions would constitute discrimination on the basis of gender identity. And I think it's safe to say that the battle between the federal government and state governments over how to protect women's sports and female athletes looks like it will continue for the foreseeable future.
Well, Ryan, thank you so much for joining us today and breaking down those two issues. Everybody listening, you can head over to Christian Post and you can read more of Ryan's work and keep up on the news daily. Also, be sure to head over to the Edify app. It's EDIFI. Download the app where you can hear thousands of Christian podcasts today. We will see you again next week for another episode of the Christian Post podcast. Thanks again, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you for having me.